great pleasure for me to host this session with my panelists today. And today what we'll be doing is we'll be unpacking this whole dimension of social emotional learning, especially for students and teachers in the current environment that we are, which is online, blended, kind of a mixed. And before I go further, I would want to start with a small quote, which is by Aristotle, which is educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. So I would really want to start with the fact that, it's important that we connect ourselves fully. We look at different dimensions of selves as person, as educators, as people engaged in education ecosystem. So in education system, we often talk about whole child development, and when we say whole child development, basically what we entail is looking at cognitive, social, emotional, creative, physical aspects of child development. And within that, social emotional learning is something which is foundational to whole child development. And there's enough evidence globally as well as emerging in India, which clearly shows how social emotional learning could be foundational with respect to your academic gains, with respect to positive attitudes, pro-social behavior. And more importantly, right now, these skills are transferable skills. You can, and also speak very much to the process of, where learning is a social process. And in any form of learning, emotions are an integral part of learning. So it's important to kind of, focus and prioritize these. Again, National Education Policy 2020 kind of outlines the importance of social emotional learning skills for everyone, for children. Um, Being true to myself, I'll again, before handing on to panel, I'll start with one more quote, which is like this. Too often we underestimate the power of a touch, a kind word, a listening ear, an honest compliment, or smallest act of caring, all of which have the potential to turn the life around. And, and it'll be cliche if we say that this is only important for children. To be honest, we feel that this is important just for any adult playing various roles in life of children, be it a teacher, be it a caregiver, be it a parent. So it's important for everyone. So on the panel today, we've got a great set of experts and practitioners who are working closely with communities, with learning ecosystems in different ways towards embedding social emotional learning aspects into our educational practices and curriculums and assessments. So first, I would like to start with introducing our first panelist. Subbu Parameswaran is the co-founder and CEO of Learning Curve Foundation, a non-profit that is dedicated to transforming education for underserved children in India through social emotional learning. Prior to joining development sector, Subbu has working experience of 15 years in the pharmaceutical industry in both UK and India in multiple roles. He's also have considerable experience in people development and consulting side. His interests lie in advancing the field of SEL in India and building cost-effective and replicable models for social impact. At Learning Curve, he leads the work around strategy, funding, and partnerships. Welcome, Subbu. Our next panelist is Neha. So Neha comes with a decade of work experience in both corporate and non-profit sector. Neha is deeply passionate about working with children and youth. She's worked in training and development and executive search business in the past. Neha gets her energy from facilitating youth groups, and in her previous role with Pyramid Foundation for Education Leadership, she was engaging with young change leaders to discover and chalk out their social impact journeys through self-change. Before that, at Manzil, which is a non-profit based in Delhi, as part of the core team, she has designed and facilitated Hello Zindagi, which is a unique offering for the youth to discover their passion and transition to professional phase of their life. Neha, in her current role, has been instrumental in the global launch of social, emotional, and ethical learning, C Learning curriculum, with Vana Foundation, with Emory University, and the Dalai Lama Trust. She's currently co-leading the North India operations for C Learning in India to disseminate the curriculum and support schools and organizations adopt C Learning in their context. Welcome, Neha. Our next panelist is Shrutika. Shrutika began her journey in development sector as a teacher in a low-income school, where she's worked with community for 2 years and witnessed stark realities of inequity in our system. In her 10 years of experience in the sector, Shrutika has worked directly with beneficiaries, set up operations for NGOs like Teach for India, liaised with government and other stakeholders to drive impact. Shrutika was instrumental in launch of India School Leadership Institute. This is the first school leadership training program in Mumbai. In her current role with Dasra, Shrutika is part of transformation and impact team, working with philanthropic capital and supporting funders and NGOs in their journey to impact. Welcome, Shrutika, to this panel. The panel discussion. So first of all, I would want to invite Subbu. And Subbu, if you could talk about, unpacking the social emotional learning and what is the role that SEL can potentially play in, building back better.
Sure. Thank you, Neeta, for introducing all of us. Of course, thank you, Quest team, and it's good to be here this morning. I have 255 participants. That's brilliant. So it would be interesting to see how the panel turns out. So to your question, right, I think great start to unpacking almost what is SEL, right? I think we should probably unpack that a little bit. And I thought instead of just sort of giving a standard sort of theoretical response on it, I wanted to invite the audience to participate with me and indulge me in a little bit in terms of, I wanted to ask a few questions. And I wanted the audience to sort of respond in the chat box. Very simple to respond. All you have to do is say yes if you think that's the case, or remain silent. That's completely your call. So what I wanted to do maybe over the next couple of minutes maybe is basically take the audience back a little bit through time. And I want to start there and kind of bring you back to present day, and then we can kind of synthesize what SEL actually means, right? So all you have to do is basically type yes if you agree with what I'm saying, or if you think that was the case with you. So let me first take you back to your first day of school. Everybody remembers a little bit about their first day of school. And if on your first day of school, if you felt a little scared, then type yes. I can see the yeses pouring in. So we all did, right? We all felt a little bit scared, a little bit anxious, kya hoga, kaun hoga, and all of that. Now let me fast forward a little bit. Now you're 10 years old, right? You're already in 5th grade. And if you had a subject that you didn't really like, then type yes. If you had a subject that you didn't really like so much, then type yes. Getting some yeses there. Okay. Now a follow-on question to this. If you didn't like the subject, not because of the subject, but because of the teacher, then type yes. So we all had subjects that we didn't like, we were scared of, right? And a lot of time we were also scared of the teacher, right? So there's that connection there. Now let me push you forward a little bit into your teenage years and ask you, type yes if you really, really wanted to be part of a group of school friends. There's always this group in school that we've all aspired to be part of. Type yes if you wanted to be part of that group. Yeah, some guys saying, nah. Yeah, I know teenagers like to stay by themselves. I understand that. See that happening. But yes, a lot of us did want to be part of that group and felt like we're part of something, right? Then let's go further a little bit more. You're 18, 20 years old. And if there were times when you felt that you're trying to communicate something and the other person really didn't understand what you were trying to say, if the other person didn't get it, then type yes. So there have been many times, yes, 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 I can see that in the chat. Oh yes, I can see that in the chat as well, right? And now I'll bring you back to present day, right? if you feel that your school or in whatever sphere of education you were in those years, if your school could have prepared you better for life, then type yes. And I saw an of course, they're very emphatic. And we all sort of feel that. And a lot of us feel that, you know what, I think when we went out of school, basically there were a few things that hit us which we didn't quite figure out, right? And we wish that we could have learned some of that early on. But thank you for responding that. Right? So I've hopefully tried to take you in a very short span of time, then a flashback to sort of present day. But if I were trying to synthesize some of this, right? If I was trying to synthesize some of this, there are certain aspects that I wanted to sort of share. One is that, and I hope you'll sort of agree and this will resonate. One is that our emotions are at the core of pretty much everything that we do, pretty much everything that we learn, pretty much every decision that we make, right? And it's almost like we feel and therefore we learn, which is why you said you didn't like a subject because you felt a certain emotion towards the subject, but most likely towards the teacher or towards the environment which is influencing you. The second point being that we are all inherently very social beings, right? We have this inherent desire to be part of something. We have this desire to build relationships. We have this desire to be recognized. We also have this desire to have a sense of belonging, right? Which is why we go to school, which is why we want to be part of a group, which is why we want to be recognized in a group, etc. Recognized for our efforts, etc. Right? Now, interestingly, this process, whatever these two things that I talked about, starts at birth, right? Goes to your first day of school, but it doesn't ever stop, right? It carries forward with you all through your life. Even as adults today, if you were in a new place, there would still be an emotion of nervousness, there would still be an emotion of potentially excitement, etc. Right? So the process never stops. And ultimately, we all learn from what is modeled for us. As particularly as children, we always say that the teacher is the greatest influencer in the classroom. How many of us have potentially had teachers who keep telling you, "Gussa nahi karte," and this teacher will throw a duster at you every 5 minutes? Right? We've all had that experience, right? So we all learn from that modeling, isn't it? So if I was now bringing this together into what SEL is, I don't want to talk about it in terms of a curriculum, in terms of all of those are delivery models, right? But in terms of bringing that together, I think one is that SEL is a process. It's a continuum. It can't be dealt with like it's a subject. It can't be dealt with like a curriculum. It's a process that has to continue. It is applicable not just for children, but also for adults. And sometimes adults need it a lot more than children. Right? That is one. Second is, I think it is about learning, it's about practicing, but more importantly, it's also about modeling. If you and I can't model certain aspects of social emotional learning, like even regulating our emotions, we cannot possibly expect others to do it. If we cannot practice perspective taking and empathy, we cannot possibly teach empathy to a child. It's not possible to do that, right? And that's really about how you manage your emotions, how you build your relationships, and honestly, how you effectively sort of navigate your world around it. So SEL is really a combination of all of these, isn't it? Right? And if that, I think if largely as a group we agree that that is more or less what SEL means, then when we're talking about, when we're talking about this question of building back better, I think the focus is on better, because the focus really should be on how do we get social emotional learning to become the core of education rather than one more thing on the plate. And that's how we deal with it today. SEL is one more thing on the plate. My submission to you is it is the plate. Right? And therefore, when we're building back schools, or when we're building schools even from scratch, SEL needs to be that DNA. And unless we make SEL the DNA, we're still going to be talking 10 years later, we're still going to be talking about learning loss. We're still going to be talking about the same things that we've been talking about for the last 20 years. And that's my submission to you as a group.
Thanks so much, Subbu, for emphasizing what SEL is. I see a lot of responses in chat also, which kind of resonate with what you are saying. I would now like to welcome Neha. And Neha, if you can talk about what configurations are needed in schools to enable this SEL focus. And what are the critical elements in that learning ecosystem? There is so much that can be done, but how should we go about prioritizing that within the learning ecosystem? Over to you, Neha.
Thanks, Neeta, and hello, everyone. Good morning. Neeta, when you asked that question in terms of the the constituency, or what we need in the school, my sort of mind really is stuck on this word school, and what is a school really, right? Is it the building? Is it the infrastructure? Is it the physical space that we are all when we think of school we relate to? But today, if you ask my 5-year-old nephew, he will say school is equal to laptop, school is equal to online, school is, so where is that physical space, right? So what is school? And when I reflect on that, to me really school is people, right? Like when I think of my school or my school days or my school time, I really remember people. I don't remember what color the school building was. Okay, vaguely I do, but really I have to give it some thought. Naturally, for me, school is equal to people, my friends, my teachers, people. Then, to me personally, and who's also on this call, and me, we both really try that if school is people, then what are we doing with the people, right? And what we've seen, at least in the social emotional learning space, is that when we have teachers, are we really quote unquote using teachers as a medium to disseminate something in the school, or as an instrument, or as a tool? Or are we really pausing at that human being there and not really looking at them as mere transactors, but really them as whole selves as well, right? So I'm actually going to focus on this part more, and I know that there may be many other configurations, but this is, for us, this is key, right? And in our work in the last 2 years with C-Learning in India, we've also recognized that with the teacher, what are we really doing? And one of the researches that we keep referring to is by Dr. Kimberly Shornet-Reichel. She talks about the emotional contagions that educators have, right? Like in terms of the power dynamic that they hold in the classroom space, suggests that they have a greater emotional contagion effect. And if they have an emotional contagion effect, and what Subhu was exactly talking about, that if a teacher says gussa mat karo and throws a duster at you every 5 minutes, clearly there is a child is able to see through, right? And when we see that, or when we, for example, are able to, in a social emotional learning classroom, ask or question the child about their emotions, about their regulations, strategies, etc. Are we really, or as educators, are we looking at it from this lens? Of course, C-Learning India, C-Learning program being a curriculum for children, right? It is for children ultimately, and all the other SEL programs. I mean, we've known Subbu very well, and we operate in the same space. We all work for children ultimately, but we don't want to forget the teacher there, who's the individual, and therefore the whole teacher well-being aspect of it is extremely important to us. And I would think that that is one of the configurations, right? Like if I were to just say teacher as a configuration, then it would again boil down to that transactionality. But I want to really focus on the teacher as a person and her well-being and her sort of feeling compassionate, her kindness quotient, all of that, because that through the emotional contagion will lead to a ripple effect in the entire school, leading to a change in the culture of the school, which is important, right? SEL is not, as Subhu said, because if it's school, it's not just a subject that one teacher just comes in, teaches, and goes off, right? And therefore, my second point is that we want to focus on this as a set of practices, right? And practices, therefore, you do them again and again and again. They are not, it's not a curriculum that is meant to start and end somewhere, right? When there are practices that you bring in, for example, learning play an instrument, or let's say learning to play a sport, you don't just do it one day and forget about it, right? So it's not like, acha, ek lesson kiya, aapne move on to the next lesson, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and end of the year, great, humne SEL kar liya, hamara curriculum khatam ho gaya. That's not what, at least at C-Learning India, we're focusing on, because we would really like for it to be a set of practices that an educator herself and the student can go back to again and again and again. And it took us some time to, in some ways, communicate that to educators, because they said, "Arey, but ye to same activity hai. Bacche ko already pata hai." Why, like, it's like when you bring something new, there is an aha moment or there's an insight. But when you do that same thing again, the assumption is that there is no aha moment or insight. Okay, you may be right, but there is that element of practice, because that mental muscle that gets created again and again with that practice is exactly when quote unquote social emotional learning can truly take place in a school environment, right? And my last point really is, we don't talk so much about, or we don't focus really on the how, right? Of course, there are a lot of possibilities of curriculums that are available. There are a lot of ideas, and now there is content, there's NEP that is supporting. So at the policy level, so we have all of those things in place. But are we really talking about how to do this in school? And for us, that how bit is very important. And therefore, it's not just a set of activities, but it's also about working with the educator and helping them do the how. And in the last year, because of the lockdown and everything going virtual, we also had to push ourselves, and I'm very glad we did that, because then we came up with something for parents as well. We came up with a set of activities that parents could do with children at home, right? And for them, it's not like a class. It is truly something that you would do as, let's say, in family time, right? Like my family would do those activities as part of family time. We would all sit together and say, okay, family time, let's do this, right? So that's when the whole, like for the child, the world is not then separate in terms of what's happening inside the classroom or what's happening in that 1 hour of virtual class versus what's happening around her. So just bringing all of those elements is extremely important to us. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Neha. That was very powerful to talk about each individual in that ecosystem as a human being in themselves and their role. I would now invite Shrutika. Shrutika, if you can talk a bit about, knowing that where we are in COVID, have been in continuous lockdown for quite some time, how should we build an urgency to address needs of children more holistically, and especially knowing the diverse country that we are, looking at dimensions of access and equity there. Would love to hear your perspectives.
Thanks so much, Neeta and Subbu and Neha. Some really great points there, and I want to reference that as I'm going to just respond to the question. Um, I was a teacher 10 years ago in the classroom. And as a teacher, for me, it was always about learning to priority, because it was so important to make sure that children could read, write, and do their work, etc. It never came as a very strong awareness as a teacher that I have to also focus on how my children are feeling and getting them to acknowledge their emotions and be in sync with them. And also never occurred in all of the training that we did as teachers that was important to ask ourselves also. I fast forward, like as Subbu has taken us through this timeline, I fast forward to being a mom and a mother now in COVID. And now there is a lot of awareness around just, emotions and mental health, etc., that's bringing to surface the fact that how I am with my emotions is so important before I can be that with my child. And I think about it as a teacher, 10 years ago, it was just missing in my consciousness. It may have been subconscious in just the relationship we have with our students. And it brings me to the point, I think, that some of us were discussing when we were preparing for this, is why it has taken COVID for us to suddenly kind of have this conversation. When emotions and how we feel has been a core part of us as humans, and some of in the chat also we've been seeing, and someone pointed that out really well, is how are we with ourselves and, in our families, it's always been a part of our work. So why has COVID pushed it out in the front? And okay, now that it has, let us leverage this to really make it what Subbu said, the plate, right? And right now we are talking about teachers and students, but there are a lot of people, as we know, as educators, that operate in this ecosystem. There is the school principal, and there's so much the school principal needs to do. uh, in Neha's point on the how can we equip them to also take up the mandate of social emotional learning for their teachers and then have that trickle down to the students. When I think about governments, and the fact that we have a policy now that calls it out, but often the gap is when we are implementing it, right? So how do we break that down, and really build that urgency around it? I think some of the conversations we have, even with CSRs and some of the funders, there's still a lot of focus around learning gap, etc., which is true, but you can't see that anymore in isolation. You can't see social emotional learning is one bucket and then learning outcomes is one bucket. And I think there's a lot more work that the ecosystem needs to do to bring that together. And if I had to put out a how just to help us imagine, where is the campaign around how children are feeling right now, right? We have a campaign around learning. We have a campaign around the fact that data around the fact that children are this many grade levels behind. Where is the data around how students are feeling when schools have been shut, they've been disconnected from their peers? I think and I'm sure there's information and data collected somewhere, but it's not catching our attention as much as it needs to. And I think that's how we need to build that as a way to bring about the urgency as well, bring out those linkages. That's one. Second is, and I think Neha spoke about that, and brought that in, we're talking about digital environment, but it warrants the question about students who are not connected digitally. Um, and we have a huge percentage of that in our country. And so the teacher, yes, is throwing the duster at home. The mother is throwing the father is throwing something else at home, and that is also affecting the emotions of children. And so it's so important to handhold parents through that as well. And we have to identify then who are those actors in the system to be able to enable the shift, for the teachers, for the students, and also for the parents. So I think there's a need for that, a very common dialogue to happen that really brings out these interlinkages both across the different players, and also across like learning, both as learning outcomes and social emotional as well. I want to pause here, and invite, I think, Subbu and Neha to kind of give their inputs, because they are the real practitioners on the ground, kind of working through this. I've of course kind of given some of the overview from my own experience, but also for the participants as educators, what are some of the tools that possibly you have been using, be it with parents, be it as teachers, even as mothers, fathers with your children, that you feel is kind of breaking down the barriers between नहीं पहले पढ़ाई करना जरूरी है फिर देखते हैं how you're feeling and क्या what your emotions, and those things are like. How do we bring that together a little bit? So I'll just pause there and would love to again hear from Subbu and Neha.
Sorry, if I can, I just wanted to sort of build on one point that Shrutika, you pointed out, especially in terms of when we talk about sort of learning loss, learning outcomes, and all of that, right? One is fundamentally, I feel that basically we've sort of narrowed down this definition of learning far too much. I think that is one ecosystem issue that we need to really figure out, right? The definition of learning can't just be restricted to basically just a sort of standardized test score in a particular subject, right? I think it needs to go beyond that. The second point is, you said something to the lines of no longer can we see sort of SEL and other things, or other things and SEL, right? And there's science to it, right? Basically, we'll have to stop thinking about cognitive and non-cognitive. Because what science tells us, and it's been telling us this for the last 50, 60 years now, is that basically all learning, memory, decision making actually happens at the intersection of emotion and cognition. So without all of this together, it won't work. It just won't work, right? And I just wanted to make that point. And this is something that this is something that I think we've also realized during the course of our work, obviously, right? And it's not something that just came to us, and we realized this during the course of our work. And as we started building our work to looking at it more holistically, we then started looking at, okay, how do we work with teachers? How do we make sure that the whole aspect of teacher as a person, teacher well-being is done? How do you then give them a space and a configuration for them to use this in the classroom? How do you then help parents to bring it home? And how do you then work with the school to make sure it becomes a DM? So only when you do all of this will it actually make any sense. And that's really the point that I wanted to sort of build on. But great point, Shrutika. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thanks, Subbu. That was very insightful. I do have like one last question that I do want to pose to all three of you, which is on, as we've transitioned during these COVID times into an online environment, would love to hear, how, and such a innate item like social emotional learning, what are the opportunities and risks of doing something in a blended model? Of course, on one side of the spectrum, there is an access issue, an inequity issue, but even those who have access, like what are the opportunities and what are the challenges? Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts there.
Neha, would you like to give it a shot?
Sure, I have a short one for this. I really, and this is of course I'm fully aware that I'm coming from my own personal bias, is that the online. So for me, the school had two elements, and this is again from my own personal experience. One is the doing bit, and one is the being bit, right? Where when it comes to the doing bit, I think the online space has done wonderfully, because what we were quote unquote doing in the school has in some ways been taken over in the online space, and we are able to do almost everything that we were able to do in a physical space. Of course, the sports is different, the dance class is different, nobody's sitting next to me, all of that is different. But in terms of, the children experiencing the doing bit, there's a fair bit of experience available on that. What is missing though is the being bit, right? And I know I'm starting off with the with the limitations of the online space, but really, while I appreciate the doing bit that the online space offers, the being bit that is missing is something that it really it aches me, because yes, I mean, C-learning has also benefited from the online space, right? Today, we're able to reach many, many more teachers and educators that we wouldn't otherwise, right? Because the physical space has its own limitations, right? So we are happy with that. But what we constantly keep reminding ourselves is that it's, we can't sit back and relax and say, hey, okay, great solution. We want to remind ourselves that this is only makeshift, this is only temporary, and we need to then therefore make sure that the being bit is nurtured when there is possibility. So if we talk about blended learning, I would say do all the doing bit online and do all the being bit when you meet physically. So it will be such a beautiful sort of it's like students will look forward to going to school, right? Because what they're going to get there is hopefully a lot of nurturance. And I just want to end, with this very beautiful quote that keeps coming back to me. And because Neeta led the way for quotes, I'm really sort of compelled to share this, because I read somewhere and it really spoke to me. It's a 5-word quote, which is, the heart of education is the education of heart, right? And this is something I personally don't want to forget as a new mom, and as someone who works with educators, and further they work with children. So I consider myself also working in that space or contributing in that space. I want to constantly keep reminding myself that education, it's really the core, as Subbu said, the heart of education is the education of heart. So I don't want to compromise on that by just, being happy about the online and the digital space. Thanks.
Uh, Sorry, if I can just add one point. I mean, Neha, I have to agree with everything you just said, right? Because although we've had a similar experience, obviously, in terms of, when you're doing online, you can reach many more teachers, etc. We even sort of tried, quote unquote, blended. I'm just putting that quote unquote there because honestly, I don't think any of us have actually figured out what blended learning really means. We are yet to crack the code on that, right? And we're just talking about it, but the vocabulary is not enough. We haven't really cracked what blended learning is. So I think the experience of the physical space, the fact that learning is a social process, cannot be taken away. Just cannot be taken away. And how much ever I think we try and build online spaces, I think it will help. It will help from a content perspective. It will help from a dissemination perspective. But I have my doubts as to whether it will help create the being perspective, that you so eloquently sort of say, right? And that's really my own sort of view on it, right? It will help you, but it's got its set of challenges that we haven't cracked yet. So yeah.
I just want to say that it's very evident that Subbu and I have a certain bias, and that's precisely why we work in the SEL space.
And I just wanted to add that I think what has happened is that because of COVID, we were suddenly overnight kind of almost pushed into this digital space. And now we are kind of grappling to figure out what fits, like what's good for digital and how can we use digital in the best way, and what it's not good for, and therefore how do we use some of this physical space for. And I think if I look into the future, we are looking very much at a hybrid model now. We may not have schools open for extended periods of time. We may have, some of the online stuff happening. So if we can prepare ourselves better for when that happens, to know, okay, when it's online, this is how it's best used for. When it's physical, you make most of it. Otherwise, we're going to be in a chaos where we're just recreating everything. जो नहीं हो रहा है उसको online में cover करो, जो online नहीं हो रहा है इसमें cover करो. I think there's an opportunity and some time we have to be able to do that a little bit better as well.
So yeah, I think just figuring out multiple ways of content dissemination does not create a learning experience. I think that's really my point, right? So
Great. Thank you, everyone. I think you've made some great points, and we've got some very good questions on the chat. I know Neha has tried to respond to a few of them. I do want to pick up on 2-3 questions, and I'm also trying to club these questions now together. One is, I think, on this piece of educators in this puzzle and maybe caregivers as well. And there are 2 questions that link there, which is, can we condition adults in SEL when almost 1/4 of their learning condition has not seen SEL learning? And related to this is, how does the need of well-being can be established with an adult without having the need to making a connection to performance or becoming a better teacher? Any thoughts on this would be appreciated. So slightly different nature of questions, but would love if any one of you want to quickly respond to these.
I have a theory on that, if I can. I have a theory on that question. When we talk about well-being, let's just consider sort of the impact of well-being on performance or productivity. Right now, we're talking sort of almost corporate-ish kind of language, and that's okay, right? I think that's nothing wrong with that. The fact is basically that today, increasingly organizations, whether they are for-profit, non-profit, etc., basically are actually looking at how employee or personal well-being basically has an impact on productivity and performance, and there are very clear linkages between the two. And that's obviously been amplified by all this. We're all working in communal environments, and everybody's running around the house, juggling multiple things, right? So there's a very clear connect. And as a person, it's very simple, right? If basically I don't start out my day with a calm sort of emotion because there's something happening in the background, I'm not going to give my best. So and to the point that basically, well, is it too late for adults? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it is still possible for us to learn. It will be slower because we'll have to unlearn. But it is possible for us to learn how to regulate our emotions and manage those better. So those correlations work in every space. Personal space, corporate space, non-profit space, doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and if I may just add 2 lines to that. One is, I think this paradigm of when we say we're learning something or teaching something, we forget that we're not starting from zero. We all know in some ways how to manage our emotions, right? If I get angry, I know how to in some ways shift my anger to, let's say, feeling better. What I think the SEL space provides for is a conscious effort and a proactive effort in building these skills instead of letting, let's say, time do the magic, or something else do the magic, or someone else do the magic. That's one. And two is to start early, and therefore with children. I don't think, at least personally, I don't think that this is not meant for adults. If time, space, and my capacity would allow me, then I'd be very happy to even work with adults, right? Because I'm working with myself with exactly these same skills. What I'm only trying to do is focusing on children, because we say, okay, if you start early, then they become adults who are more sort of self-aware, taking responsible decisions and conscious, aware choices, all of those things, right? So I think it's just that it's not like we're learning something new, and therefore I don't think it's something that only children can learn, or children can learn better and adults can't. That divide, I think we need to shift from that paradigm. We need to shift the perspective there.
Thanks. No, that's super. I think there are a lot of other questions coming in. I'm wondering if one of you want to take the question from Shelza on the space design, and that playing a role in the blended learning challenge. Shelza, do you want to give a narrative to your question? If not, maybe I'll just read it out. So the question is, can space design play a role in cracking blended learning challenge, designing learner experience to reimagine space as a cognitive stimuli and let it play a role in making learning environments without homes, and without schools enabling? What might that really require of the SEL framework then? I don't know if you've got any immediate thoughts there.
I just on top of my mind, I'm not an expert in how we design digital systems or space design that Shelza is referring to, but I think what I'm picking up from the question is there is a lot to be done in how we use digital for some of the work that we want to do within SEL. And again, to our point, like let's expand to say like learning, right, for children in general, where SEL is at the core as well. There's definitely potential to do that. I think in the ecosystem, and just speaking as with governments and funders, etc. Also, we are waiting to see some of those innovations that come in, and I think the demand is going to push for that, for some of these innovations to happen, for us to be able to experiment that. But we have to see it take off somewhere. So just to say that there is need to figure that space out a little bit, and of course there's potential. I think the question is whether where the curriculum is right now, or the how of what Neha was speaking, and Subbu, what you do as well, does that allow for a seamless integration into this digital space as of now? And if not, then are we losing out on an opportunity, or are we saying that no, there is a SEL works best when it's physical, so let it be that way? And what happens in the digital space? Is there some kind of conversation, I think, to happen there? Sorry, I added another question into that question, but it's just something that was on my mind that I thought I'd just take that. But yeah, if anyone wants to answer that one also. So,
no, thanks for answering the question with another question. I think that was already a complex question. But no, I think just to honestly, we're not sort of design experts in any of that, right? But I think my larger viewpoint, I think, is really that where we are in terms of the domain of SEL today, and I would maybe speak particularly for India, we haven't even converged on a common vocabulary of SEL. we use SEL interchangeably with pretty much anything that we want to, right? So basically, I don't think we are in the space basically where we even converse on what SEL actually means and how, and then it's like how you can actually take it back into an experiential sort of medium. You can do SEL in multiple different content types, right? I mean, you can create videos and you can create all of that, right? Content types are very different from basically creating that sort of space design that Shelja was talking about. So no, I think we're about 20, 30 years behind the curve on that one for sure.
Thanks, Shelza. Some very interesting questions still coming in. I think questions around how do we make SEL the plate? It's been asked like by two different people in different ways. I know we are really running out of time, but maybe this is just the last question that I would like to pick from this. If anyone wants to respond, I know there have been nuggets in between, but any final thoughts there, and then maybe we'll close.
So, I mean, if you want to make SEL the plate, essentially you use it everywhere, do it everywhere. When your day begins at home, think about your emotions, think about how you're going to manage, think about how you're going to build those interactions, right? When children go to school, think about basically what practice will you start with to make them feel welcome in the classroom before saying open your books to page number 24. And the more you internalize these practices, the more then we don't have to talk about SEL curriculum or integrating with academic curriculum and all of those very esoteric sort of subjects, right? I think if you want to make SEL your plate, essentially you'll have to start it and do it all day long. That's the only way you can get it, and make sure that everybody does it. So as I keep saying that SEL is everybody's business. It's not just teachers' business. It's not just a school principal's business.
Yeah.
Make it everybody's business. It will become the plate.
Yeah, and maybe don't confine SEL to a subject, because the moment we do that, it only is for students by teachers, designed by someone, right? But if we like Subbu mentioned, and I'm only reiterating what he said, we look at it as a set of practices that are helpful or healthy for all of us to have. I think that's where the key lies. The shift is practices and not so much about subjects or confining ourselves to that learning.
So if I can add just one more thing to say, that we want more conversation and dialogue around this, and we need more data and information around this. It comes as a very quickly saying, oh my God, learning outcomes are so bad, two grade levels behind, 3 grade levels behind. Can we, combine that and see, and children are feeling comfortable in a classroom, or today, they feel like they have a friend to speak to, whatever, like what could be those data points and indicators that we pull out together and give that equal importance? Because if we don't measure it, if we don't talk about it, we won't give it that much importance, and we'll still see it as separate buckets. So that would just be my 2 cents on that. Back to you, Neeta.
Great, thank you. I think these are great points. I think by practicing it ourselves, by making it part of the system at large at different levels, I think that's a critical one. And charity begins at home. And I would want to end this panel with saying that Subbu graciously has also developed some practices around SEL that we can adopt as individuals, as educators, and we can share it through Quest2Learn and Quest Alliance platform. And we would love to hear your, once you start imbibing some of those practices, would be great. And likewise, Neha and C Learning has great set of activities that they offer with respect to SEL practices. I would really encourage all the participants here to also be part of that journey. And I'm sure many of you may already be. So once again, thanks everyone